Hello, my name is John Nimmo, and I'll be presenting today on open source. So first we have the agenda. We'll define open source, talk about the history, how it came to be. Oops. Talk about the differences between open source, free software, and proprietary software, the importance of open source, some of the significant developers of open source software, and where open source stands today. So first, what is open source? On the screen, you see the dictionary definition of open source, but the important words there is a type of software that is free of charge. So there are actually originally open source was designated an approach or a specific way of creating computer programs that the public can inspect, use, modify, or enhance. But today, open source is becoming more of a set of values. Some call it the open source way. It's expressed principles of open exchange, collaborative participation, and community-oriented development. So the history of open source, talk about Richard Stallman, the Cathedral and the Bazaar, which is an essay, Netscape, and OSI. And then on the screen is a quote from Richard Stallman. So who was Richard Stallman? He started working in an MIT artificial intelligence lab in 1971. They had a problem with the printers, and his office built a program to solve the printer malfunction. However, once he was trying to figure out the program, he found out that a lot of the programmers in the division started signing non-disclosure agreements, so they couldn't share work from any of their projects. So that inspired him to start the GNU project, which he launched in 1983. And his goal was to build an operating system that was free to use. And what he meant by free is he meant more of it as a free speech kind of way, not a free beer. So more of like a freedom of the operating system, not free economically. Um, he started the Free Software Foundation in 1985, which housed funding for the GNU project. Um, so he basically started the movement towards free to use operating systems. Next is the next important part of open source history is an essay written in 1997 by Eric Raymond titled The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Eric Raymond was a free software advocate at the time. The Cathedral refers to Stallman's GNU Emacs, in which the source code was made by a small group of developers, yet distributed freely with software releases. And the Bazaar referred to Linus Torvalds' Linux kernel, in which the source code is developed over the internet in public. So those two actually ended up combining to fulfill Stallman's dream of a free operating system. Next, we have Netscape, and after Raymond's essay, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, Netscape decided to make the code for Netscape Communicator, which was their internet suite, open source, so that other people can access it freely and edit it freely. And that open source internet suite became the basis for Mozilla Firefox, which almost everyone has heard of. It became a very relevant browser in the 2000s. And Mozilla Firefox was really important in proving the validity of open source at the time. Next, you have the Open Source Initiative, or OSI. Um, the release of Netscape and Mozilla, it led to a convention of programmers in Palo Alto, California in 1998. Eric Raymond and Bruce Perens. Eric Raymond was the author of the important essay, and they ended up founding the open source initiative after the convention. The main goals of the open source initiative are focusing mainly on explaining and protecting the open source label. So they're a big educational and advocacy organization. And one important note of the Palo Alto Convention was that Christine Peterson, one of the attendees, she actually coined the term open source while they were there. So what is the difference between open source and proprietary software? Um, so proprietary software, also known as closed software, it's mainly copyrighted technologies. Only the creators or controllers of the program can modify it. The users sign license agreements, agreeing to the owner's terms of use. And a big example of that is the Microsoft Office suite, such as Windows, sorry, not Windows, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and then also programs such as Adobe Photoshop. Open source, on the other hand, most licenses let users do as they wish with the software. Um, one term open source likes to use is copyleft to describe some of their licenses, which require anyone who modifies and shares a program must also share the source code alongside. And a big part of open source is that it promotes collaboration on the software. And in this chart, you can see many open source equivalent softwares to the proprietary softwares. So what makes software free? In order for software to be considered free, the user must have the freedom to run the program as they wish, use it for any purpose they would like. The user is able to modify the program to suit his or her needs. An important part of this is the access to the source code, which we will touch on later. User must be able to redistribute copies. They could do that either freely or could charge a fee. And the user should also be able to distribute their own versions of the program so that the community can benefit from their improvements. And some open source softwares require them to attach the previous version as well when they redistribute and distribute. So what is the source code? The source code is basically the defining factor between open source and proprietary software. So the source code is the main code that programmers can manipulate to change how the software works. So um, In the previous slide, in order for software to be open source, the users must be um, free to modify it. So, in order to modify the program, generally the user needs the source code of it to make major changes because without it, programs can be very difficult to modify. So, if the source code is not available, then it's not necessarily open source because the user can't modify it as they would like. And likewise, with proprietary software, they don't release the source code. So, what's the difference between free software and open source? Um, so, there are two, the main difference is philosophical. So, there are two main perspectives. Uh, the open source side, they like to think that open source and free software are synonymous and interchangeable. They basically just mean the same thing because open source is free software and free software is open source. However, the free software perspective, they believe that open source doesn't convey the full importance of the movement. Um, the free software perspective, they believe that the open source focuses too much on practical benefits of free to use software and source codes, and they don't put enough importance on the ethical issues of proprietary software and why it's intrinsically right for software to be free. So they generally mean the same thing, but it just depends on who you ask. They may have different definitions of the two words. So what makes open source important? Um, Open source is a foundational software in the sense that almost anyone using the internet benefits from some sort of open source program. There are also universal benefits of open source, such as efficiency of community driven development because of the wide ranges of people working on it, and also profitability because it's generally, well, I mean, because it's open source, it's cheaper than proprietary software. Um, Open source is also moving into cloud computing. So a big, um, the big proprietary cloud computing operating system is Google Apps. Um, but open source systems include OwnCloud and Nextcloud, and as well as operating system cloud computing platform OpenStack, which is a common open source platform for um, people developing in the cloud computing field. So, what are some benefits of open source? It allows control and the control to change parts that you don't like. Also, the control to use the software for any purpose. Open source helps with training. It helps people become better programmers because they have to continuously access the code. It's also publicly accessible, so it makes it easier to kind of train whenever you would like. Yeah, and it can be viewed and edited anywhere you would like. It provides some stability. Some proprietary softwares, they become outdated if the creators stop working on them. But many open source programs won't disappear or become outdated because of the community involved editing. It Open source also provides some security. Um, The software can be modified easily if there's a mistake in it. Um, and there are many people accessing the software that can recognize the mistakes. There's some important developers of open source software. There's Linux, as mentioned before, as a family of operating systems based on the Linux kernel, created by Linus Torvald. There's Firefox, which is the Netscape browser, web browser. There's Ubuntu, which is based on Linux. It's popular platform for cloud computing. WordPress, based on PHP and MySQL, is a website creation platform. Android's a big one. It's an Android operating system, also from Linux, obviously used mainly for smartphones. And then Apache, which is a cross-platform web server software. So where is open source today? A 2010 Open Source Systems Management Survey that was conducted over nearly 4 years said 98% of enterprises use some sort of open source software in regular business. It also said that 76% of enterprises preferred to use open source whenever it was possible. And in this picture, you can see a couple of the other big open source programs. Obviously, there's the OSI, Open Source Initiative, Java, and MySQL are three more big ones. So today's challenges of open source include problems with licensing. Open source creators are having trouble licensing their programs to ensure that the source code can be accessed or redistributed. Sometimes they have trouble with people taking their programs and then making them inaccessible. There's also the biggest problem, or the biggest reason people don't like open source, is the lack of support provided. The same 4-year survey on the last slide also had the result that the #1 reason organizations choose proprietary tools is because of the lack of support. However, in today's industry, that actually opens up opportunities for those skilled in open source projects, because there's such a widespread use of them and a moving towards them, that having the skills of the support, you can actually make a living off of helping people use free software as well as developing the software yourself. As you can see in this chart, the proprietary satisfaction rate is much greater than the free and open source satisfaction rate, as well as there was 0% not at all satisfied with proprietary. So to recap, we defined open source as generally a software that's free to use, free to edit, modify, redistribute. The history of open source with Richard Stallman, the Cathedral and the Bazaar, Mozilla and Netscape, and the Open Source Initiative. We talked about the differences between open source, free, and proprietary softwares. Talked about the importance of open source software, and then also the main developers, and kind of where open source stands today. And I think it's continuously on the rise. as long as there becomes a better support system for it, then more people would be more likely to use it. So here are all of my references, and that's all I have. Thank you.